Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Darius Lakdawala. I'm the Director of Research at USC's Schaeffer Center and a professor in USC's Price School of Public Policy and School of Pharmacy. I'd like to welcome you to today's panel, which is on approval and reimbursement of Alzheimer's disease therapy. It's a webinar that's hosted by the USC Schaeffer Center. During today's session, our panelists are going to discuss the regulatory challenges of approving and reimbursing novel therapies for Alzheimer's disease. And I'll note this is the last webinar in our four-part series on innovation in Alzheimer's disease. Today, we're going to be hosting a discussion with our two distinguished panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment, Rachel Sachs and Joe Grogan. It'll be followed by audience Q&A. Remember that you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Let me take a few minutes to introduce our panelists, but I don't have nearly enough time to do them justice entirely. Joe Grogan is a non-resident senior fellow at the USC Schaeffer Center. Joe served as Assistant President and Director of the Domestic Policy Council under President Donald J. Trump. He also served as Associate Director of Health for the Office of Management and Budget. And also, notably, he's worked inside the FDA. So we're going to ask him a lot of hard questions about the FDA today as well. Rachel Sachs is the Tryman Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Rachel is a nationally renowned scholar of innovation policy, exploring intellectual property law, food and drug regulation, and health law. So please join me in welcoming our two distinguished panelists. What I'd like to do is give each of them an opportunity to provide a brief overview of their thoughts on these issues, and then I'll jump into a moderated discussion and as well as Q&A with all of you in the audience. So I'll start with Rachel first. Rachel, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. So I want to make three very, very brief points. First, I want to pick up on a theme from the framing of the webinar, which noted that we have twin goals of rewarding innovation and ensuring access. And those are both critical goals, but sometimes they're in tension, and Aduhelm is an example that really illustrates some of these challenges. So approving the drug and providing reimbursement for it might provide Alzheimer's patients with access, but I would argue that it does not necessarily reward innovation and might even harm it. If we provide reimbursement for drugs that may not work, it could discourage the development of drugs that do work in a whole series of ways. My second point is that the elephant in the room here is, of course, the price of the drug, particularly when compared to its evidence base and its potential overall budgetary impact. So Medicare Part B mostly functions as a price taker. It has to pay for essentially all products that are reasonable and necessary. And because of its structure, it can't really push back on pricing. That's unusual. So many other payers in this country and most payers in other countries don't function that way. And frankly, I'm not sure if we'd be having this conversation if either Biogen had priced the drug much more in line with what analysts had expected, closer to $10,000 than $56,000, or if Medicare had the ability to negotiate for the prices of drugs or to pay based on demonstrated clinical benefits. And then third, and most briefly, today we really are focused on the roles that FDA and CMS can play here, but we should always keep in mind that they're not the only relevant actors. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the role FDA and CMS can play in encouraging innovation and access, and it's definitely important, but any comprehensive that leaves out the role of something like the NIH in funding basic research, I think would be limited. And so I like to keep those tools in the back of my mind as well.
Thanks, Rachel. Joe?
Thanks, Darius, and thank you, Rachel, for getting us kicked off here. Having worked at FDA and having worked at the Office of Management and Budget, which sort of frequently finds themselves mediating disputes between FDA and CMS, such as this one, To me, this is clearly a case where CMS encroached upon FDA's role to evaluate safety and effectiveness. As you mentioned, we wouldn't be in this discussion if the price had been lower to begin with. CMS is specifically prohibited from evaluating price. But of course, we all admit, and they will privately, that they wouldn't have taken this action if they were not concerned about the price. But it goes beyond Biogen's AgileHelm, because I certainly can't defend Biogen's launch. I can't defend their choice of price. It was probably the worst launch of any drug in American history, and it resulted in their senior management basically getting largely decapitated. But the price is being paid by Alzheimer's patients and by other pharmaceutical companies who are moving into this therapeutic area. CMS did not limit their decision just to AgileHelm. There could have been many ways that they did that. They could have said that they'll approve it on a very narrow label. They could have said, hey, listen, there's an investigation, which there is, and we are suspending approval until that's resolved. They could have found a much narrower scalpel. Instead, they decided to make a broad frontal assault against this therapeutic class, all the companies that are working in it, and even accelerated approval. Accelerated approval is not something, and surrogate endpoints is not something that payers really like. They want a longer trajectory for treatments to go through the system. They're not, as a general rule, super pro innovation, cheering on FDA when they approve new therapies under shorter timelines. And unfortunately, FDA over the last 15 years or so has done a tremendous job in updating their regulatory procedures to reflect the science. And what we see here is that CMS has not done that, nor has Congress empowered them to do that. And their tools to come up with creative reimbursement solutions has led to Alzheimer's patients and the companies that are working to bring therapies to them in a very difficult position for the near, medium, and maybe long term.
Terrific. Okay. Well, I have a ton of questions for both of you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. But let me begin with just a few clarifying questions and I'm intrigued about having you guys follow up on a few points that you made. One, Rachel, I want to start with you. So you mentioned that if we approve drugs that are not effective, that it might have a chilling effect on future drug launches. I wonder if you could explain exactly what you have in mind for the mechanisms there as a first issue. And maybe, Joe, I'll give you a preview that I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you said about accelerated approval. And is accelerated approval a good framework for us going forward? And I want you maybe to weigh in a little bit more on what are the costs and benefits of accelerated approval for stimulating innovation. But I'll start with you, Rachel, on this question of the future effects on innovation.
Yeah. And so maybe I'll just start by saying that, of course, there's a question here about what is the balance of type 1 and type 2 errors at FDA? How do we think about situations in which FDA is always making decisions under conditions of uncertainty? That's the nature of the drug approval process. And there will be times when they don't get it quite right, and we shouldn't expect them to be perfect 100% of the time. But that's precisely why we have these confirmatory trial requirements and things like that. However, there are points where the agency can go too far. And so there are at least a couple of ways you might imagine that an agency which wasn't really looking critically at whether a product was demonstrating clinical benefits might lead to decreased innovation. So one would be, it might become more difficult to run clinical trials on other products going forward. So if you have patients who are now taking a different product, it may be difficult to encourage them to enroll in trials of an experimental product. Another one is more generally, you might be lowering the evidentiary bar that companies need to meet before obtaining approval. that could discourage them from developing more robust clinical evidence if they don't believe it's necessary for either FDA approval or insurance reimbursement. And then third, to the extent that there's an effect here on the types of projects that get funded, we might want to make sure that particularly for a disease that's as complex and where there's as much uncertainty about what's going on from a clinical basis, that we really want to be encouraging a diversity of approaches, of both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical approaches to treating it. And so to the extent that FDA approval pushes approval and pushes investment in one particular area, that might be potentially concerning. Obviously, I think shouldn't be a surprise. I just want to clarify from my opening remarks. I think CMS got it right here. And I think this is one of the topics about which Joe and I disagree, but I'm happy to go to him on the accelerated approval process now.
The FDA can't catch a break in many respects, right? So on the one hand, they've been criticized for moving too slowly. They've been criticized for decades for moving too slowly. And most recently in COVID, we've had a lot of that criticism. And they've been criticized for moving too quickly. When it comes to Aduhelm, there was this earlier episode of Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It's clear that reasonable people obviously disagree about whether the FDA is moving too slowly or too quickly, but it does kind of lead to a question, Joe, that I think you hinted at, which is, what is the right scope for the FDA? Are they supposed to be just figuring out if a drug is safe and letting the market sort out whether it's going to be valuable and reimbursed? Should they, in fact, take more of a proactive position in setting forth guidance on what evidence is necessary? I mean, Rachel alluded to that point. Should they be setting forth guidance on what evidence is needed in order to help us derive value from products? Should they be talking about how you design clinical trials with respect to comparators? That's another issue Rachel raised. There are a lot of things here, and you could take this in any number of directions, but I'm curious about your general thoughts about what's the role of FDA and what your views are, how the agency should view itself.
Well, they clearly should have the role of evaluating safety and effectiveness. I mean, that's in the statute. We can have theoretical arguments about whether or not they should be evaluating effectiveness. There are some people advocating that we would have more therapies on the trial and let doctors figure out once it's in the marketplace if it works or not, and do looser approval standards. I'm not quite there. But you can't alter the reality that these are difficult scientific judgment calls that people disagree about. And who do you want making the decision? Do you want a regulatory agency who is laser focused on the question of safety and efficacy, divorced from the cost considerations? Or do you want their decisions being second guessed by a group of people making decisions on a whole host of different areas with different expertise, with a whole different comparative advantage? NIH should not be second guessing FDA's decision. They don't have the same expertise. CMS should not be second guessing FDA's. And frankly, FDA should not be going over to CMS and saying, hey, listen, you guys came up with the wrong CPT code for this, and you need to reevaluate it. I mean, it's fine if they have behind the scenes discussions, but they shouldn't be calling out publicly and second guessing decisions. People need regulatory certainty. And unfortunately, what CMS has done here is they have said, which look, everybody's jealous of FDA. NIH is, CMS is. CMS came out and they second guessed FDA, and they said, we don't like this decision. We're going to second guess your medical and scientific judgment. See, FDA could have been wrong. They could have been, but frequently they're right. And the fact of the matter is, when you've got a timid agency that doesn't have, frankly, the guts to lean in and make these decisions, you leave a lot of molecules on the sidelines that never get developed. I mean, you mentioned the criticism that FDA gets. I mean, it is the first commandment at FDA that nobody loses their job at FDA for not approving a drug. You lose your job when you have a safety signal that pops up for a drug that you did approve, a safety signal that you missed. Many times that's far beyond anybody's ability to foresee a safety signal. But these are really difficult decisions when you're pouring through this data. I was there during a lot of the Celebrex, Vioxx stuff, and in the aftermath, that stuff weighs on those people for a period of time, and it can affect an agency's culture for a decade. Unfortunately, we have a hinky approval, no question about it, with Aduhelm, and it's being investigated. But the entire Alzheimer's class should not be called into question, and certainly accelerated approval, which has transformed cancer therapies in this country, transformed entire disease areas, should not be called into question. And unfortunately, it has been called in by CMS's decision here.
Hey, Rachel, I wonder if you could comment on one specific issue that Joe, I think, is raising, which is that on the one hand, there's this drug Aduhelm. On the other hand, there's this entire class of amyloid plaque reducing agents. And I wonder if you could clarify, when you're supportive of CMS, is it that you're supportive of what they did for Aduhelm, and or is it that you're supportive of what they did for the entire class, future class of agents? I mean, there's some in the pipeline. Lilly has one, and others likely might come along. Maybe to talk a little bit about that issue. Was this too broad, or was it the right breadth of decision? And why do you think it was the right breadth, if so?
Yeah, I think CMS essentially got it right. So I'll explain why. So in Medicare, the government is operating as an insurer. And as an insurer, it has an independent duty to ensure that it's paying for products which are medically necessary, products and services. And here, that's a statutory duty. Medicare is not allowed to pay for products that aren't reasonable and necessary. Medicare has to decide what that means. And typically, they do defer to FDA. Typically, we don't ask if a drug that FDA has approved for its approved indication, we can talk about off-label maybe later, whether that should be covered. But nothing about Aduhelm's approval was typical, right? Not a single member of the FDA's own advisory committee voted to approve the drug. Other countries have cast doubt on whether it should be approved there. Many private insurers came out ahead of CMS to say they wouldn't be providing reimbursement. So it's FDA that's the outlier here, in my view, not CMS. And I think that's important context. As to the specific language of the coverage determination and its applicability to Aduhelm versus the class as a whole, I think there were some clarifications between the draft NCD and the final NCD that really helped explain that what CMS is interested here is evidence of clinical benefits, because there is so much uncertainty around the viability of the specific surrogate endpoint that was used here. So CMS, in my view, is not pronouncing judgment on the class of therapeutics as a whole. It's not saying we don't think Aduhelm will work or we don't think these other products will work. It's saying we want to see a clinical benefit, and we want to see it for Aduhelm just as we want to see it for those other products. So even though FDA may approve these drugs purely on the basis of the surrogate endpoint, CMS is interested in seeing clinical benefits, and Aduhelm might show them, and these other products might show them as well. We just don't know yet.
Thank you, Rachel. So let me clarify something, maybe for the benefit of those of you who don't spend all of your time obsessing about the pharmaceutical industry like we do. But one of the issues here is that there's a surrogate endpoint, meaning does a drug remove amyloid plaque from the brain? And then there are so-called clinical endpoints, things that patients directly care about. Presumably, a patient doesn't directly care how much amyloid plaque they have on their brain, except insofar as it predicts something else, like their cognitive status or their survival or whatnot. So the question here is, what CMS is saying is that if you have a drug that shows it improves the surrogate endpoint, which is amyloid plaque, it's questioning whether reimbursement should be a foregone conclusion. One quick follow-up question I have for you, Rachel, on this issue with that clarification. It certainly has been historically the FDA's role to determine whether a surrogate endpoint is valid. And there are all kinds of surrogate endpoints that don't have causal backing, progression-free survival, even in cancer, is widely used, and it's known that a significant fraction of the time overall survival doesn't improve. So I think what I'm hearing from Joe is nervousness about CMS getting into this issue, and I thought you clarified this issue very well. It's not specifically about the class per se. It's about this accelerated approval process and the surrogate endpoint. Although it does seem like the surrogate endpoint is kind of an FDA thing. And how comfortable are you about the potential butting of heads between CMS and FDA over what would appear to be the FDA's domain, but maybe you think it shouldn't just be the FDA's domain? Could you comment on that?
This is another case where Aduhelm is maybe a particularly complex example. So I remember during the advisory committee meeting, Dr. Dunn, he specifically said to the committee, quote, "We're not using the amyloid as a surrogate for efficacy." So there wasn't even a public discussion about this. The agency had explicitly disclaimed this. So to the extent that these are exactly the kinds of scientific discussions we want the agency to be having, they were not made with the standard deliberative process in the advisory committee that we might like controversial new decisions to be made. So I think your example of progression-free survival is perfect. We know that in many cases, progression-free survival is a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict overall survival, but it's not in all cases. And we know that in some cases, there will not be an overall survival benefit. And that's the kind of situation we're envisioning the accelerated approval process, where we suspect that there's likely to be a clinical benefit, but we don't know. And so we want those confirmatory trials to be completed, and we want FDA or CMS to be able to take action if they fail, if they do not show a clinical benefit. Here, the controversy was because we do not have a history of cases in which a reduction in amyloid does lead to an improvement in the clinical benefit. And so that's part of why this was so much more controversial, unlike those previous cases.
So just maybe to summarize your view, Rachel, and make sure I understand it and that we can clarify for everybody. So there is some exceptionalism here, you're saying, for this surrogate endpoint and this drug. It doesn't necessarily mean that CMS or any other agency should question surrogates that have been used heavily in the past. It does sound, though, that you are opening the door, just correct me if I'm wrong, for other kinds of new surrogates. I mean, there are new surrogates proposed all the time. The FDA now has a process for getting new surrogates validated. Just to clarify, it sounds to me like you're comfortable with CMS getting involved with new surrogates more generally. So that is potentially an overarching issue, or you still want to limit this to Aduhelm and amyloid plaque?
Well, so one question is this a new surrogate? Because part of the evidence cited in the national coverage determination is a series of other products that lowered amyloid plaque, but did not have the effect of improving cognition or slowing the rate of cognition. So the argument here is that this actually is not a new surrogate that has been proposed that has a clear biological connection to the disease involved. The argument is that we actually have a significant or some amount of evidence that this product or that the surrogate is not connected to the clinical outcome. And in such a case, how do we think about reimbursement? So you could say it's not a new surrogate. This is an example where we actually do have evidence, and it was FDA's failure to follow the evidence which pushed CMS to act as it did.
So Joe, yeah, go ahead. I was about to just get your point.
I just want to hit on two things. One, for all practical purposes, it does, to talk about clinical benefit, it does mean a new randomized clinical trial, which is why, Biogen basically killed the drug. So it could mean if you get clinical benefit, you only have to do a registry based upon the NCD. But for all practical purposes, this surrogate endpoint may not be dead, but it's wounded grievously, and it's got to jump through a whole new hoop of scientific second guessing from CMS. And it's not just theoretical. I mean, there's 3 companies working in this area right now that are going to have to extend their development timelines and the expense in order to get this through. What worries me even more is if they were earlier in development, there would be serious discussions about just killing the program. I'm sure. But these things, these people and these companies have invested a great deal of time, money, and effort into it, and they have patients who depend on them, and they're driving them forward, much to the encouragement of the patients who are looking forward to getting these treatments. But I also want to say, look, I mean, I went through this when I was at Gilead and Sovaldi was approved. I joined Gilead 2-3 months, maybe 1 month before we bought Pharmasset and developed Sovaldi. And Sovaldi had a surrogate endpoint, breakthrough, accelerated approval. It was sustained virologic response, 12 weeks, 24 weeks. These were the endpoints. And guess what we faced? There's no validation of this. How do we know it's durable? You'd go into state Medicaid leaders and they would say, look, there's no proof of this. And oh, by the way, you didn't study it in African Americans. And we'd say, yes, we did. Here's the data on African Americans. And here's the data on intravenous drug users. And here's the data on homeless people. I mean, the war on new surrogate endpoints is directly related to cost, and we shouldn't pretend anything else. It isn't about the scientific judgment of FDA. I don't believe CMS would not have second-guessed FDA, to Rachel's point, if this had been launched at $8,000 or $10,000 or $15,000. They wouldn't have taken the risk. And when I remember at Gilead, we started, after we launch it and we're moving on to the next, there's Harvoni, there's Epclusa, we'd be doing panels and there'd be discussions. And the question was always like, we better figure out how to pay for these things, because if somebody comes out with an Alzheimer's drug, it's going to create massive problems in the system because it's a much bigger population. What will CMS do? And what I fear they've just decided is not to pay for it, because that's always what payers want. They want to pay later. They want people to die of other things. They want them to pay for different modalities and find other routes rather than they foot the bill. So it worries me, because this is a very critical area of development, and FDA made a scientific judgment. And so did all these companies as well. These aren't flunkies who just woke up one day and said, well, what about amyloid plaque? I mean, they're developing millions, they're putting millions of dollars into these development programs. And, they're not developing these products because they don't think they're going to work. They want them to work. They want them to develop, to show clinical benefit, and they want to expand the label and find other uses for them over time. I mean, that's how it works. It's not as if they're pursuing this on a whim.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to direct one to each of you. So let me begin, Rachel, with a question about the CMS decision. So do you think that, let's say that CMS's intent was narrow, and I think that, well, maybe not narrow. Narrow is not a good word. It's targeted. CMS's intent is targeted. There was a specific context here. It was about pricing. It was about a bunch of things. That said, is there a risk that even if the intent was narrow, that there could be broader effects in the future about allowing CMS to, or kind of encouraging CMS to step in for marginal cases where the FDA has made a scientific determination that, let's say, it's equipped to make? Do you have any fear that this opens the door for CMS to overstep in the future and make decisions that you think might be less targeted, just from a practical standpoint?
Yeah, so I think from my comments before, it's not a surprise that I think FDA is the one to have overstepped here and putting the decision, and Biogen, and putting the decision in a much broader context in terms of other payers and other insurers. That's where my sort of view is. So given that, I view CMS's response as an unusual and rare response to an unusual and rare exercise of FDA authority in the face of strong disagreement from other actors, including their own advisory committee. And so when I think about it from that perspective, I could certainly imagine additional use cases for the NCD process. So one discussion that we've already had is about the accelerated approval process. And we know that sometimes when drugs confirmatory trials fail, the FDA has a hard time removing those drugs from the market. It's very burdensome. It takes them years. There's a lot of public pressure on FDA not to remove the drugs, even when they're found not to have a clinical benefit or they're found to have a safety signal. You could imagine an agency, a CMS that wanted to say, we can use the national coverage determination process where a drug has failed to demonstrate a clinical benefit, and where FDA, for whatever reason, is being recalcitrant in its efforts to take the drug off the market. Now, it's possible that with this round of PDUFA reauthorization, FDA has explicitly asked for more authority to do that, to expedite that withdrawal process, because they know that public trust in these drugs, in their approval, matters. And so FDA itself may take steps to limit the degree to which CMS sees itself as needing to intervene here.
So thank you, Rachel. And this leads, actually, it's a nice segue, Joe, into another question that was asked by the audience. So Rachel has advanced the thesis that the FDA overstepped, and I suspect you have some thoughts on that, but I wonder if you can also talk about this question that we got, which is, okay, so the FDA gave Aduhelm accelerated approval in the first place. It was granted accelerated approval. As somebody who's been inside the FDA, what do you think about that decision? Just in isolation, was that the right decision? Not knowing anything about the subsequent launch or what CMS was going to do or what Biogen was going to do, was that the right decision for the FDA to have made? And just talk about what you think the FDA's perspective on this and your perspective on their decision making.
You know, I'm not nearly arrogant enough to think that my law degree is going to give me the ability to second guess the Center for Drugs. And, FDA makes mistakes, as we're witnessing in the baby formula stuff. There's no question about it. But it is their expertise that we rely upon. I have no doubt that they took this decision extremely seriously, that they worked really hard on it, that they worked beyond the Center for Drugs, that they consulted with the Center for Biologics, that they brought in, I understand, Pazder was brought in to consult the head of the oncology division at one point. They would have sweated this one, and they would have been weighing the decision, safety and efficacy, first treatment for Alzheimer's in decades, a desperate population, and the difficulty of running a trial of this magnitude and showing clinical benefit for a population that has slow cognitive decline. It's really, great in the abstract to talk about clinical benefit, but it's also very difficult to define and to find statistically significant, especially when you're dealing with a disease that operates frequently so slowly and in such different manners across populations. So they would have been weighing all that. I can tell you when it was, I'm not fired up about the price and the way Biogen launched it, but when it was approved, great. We've got a new Alzheimer's treatment. We've got the first one in decades. Let's see how it works deployed in the real world. Because frequently you can do a great job in a clinical trial, but in the real world, it doesn't do that great. But that was my initial response. And to see this therapy basically being deprived of patients and physicians is really troubling for me. And it would be a catastrophe if this entire class gets wiped out in the coming months and years, because CMS refuses to treat this surrogate endpoint with the respect, frankly, that it deserves. And these patients deserve a shot at this. I also just want to make clear, we're forgetting about the doctors and the patients and all this. They should have a choice. And this therapy has basically been deprived from them. And you've got, who makes the decision? Is it FDA makes the decision that it's safety and efficacy? CMS makes the decision that it's reasonable and necessary, which is deliberately vague and deliberately different from FDA for a reason, which is to empower them to make more decisions? Or is it the doctors and the patients?
I have a quick follow-up for you, and then I have another. I want to turn to this issue of patients, and Rachel, I'll give you a chance to add your comment as well. But my quick follow-up, Joe, so you've mentioned several times that, and I think you've implied that if FDA gets second-guessed by whether it's CMS or any number of other agencies, that this creates a number of undesirable consequences. I wonder if you could explain for all of us, what is the downside of an agency being second guessed? I mean, on the one hand, you could view it as, well, there's sort of a safety net. If FDA makes a mistake, somebody else is going to clean it up. But what do you view against that? The very simplistic notion that I have as an academic, maybe. But what are the downsides for you of second guessing an agency? And what do you think the negative consequences are in general?
Well, it's catastrophic. I mean, it's catastrophic for development and innovation because you need regulatory certainty. You need to know, is this going to go over the line or not? I mean, these companies are making big decisions with human beings and resources. What do they devote, tens of millions, if not more, into this therapeutic area or that therapeutic area? Do we go after something difficult like Alzheimer's, or should we try and make a lifestyle drug? Should we try and improve on Botox or make eyelashes longer and keep it safe rather than go for a difficult clinical endpoint? That's not just that's the effect upon the innovators, but then over time, FDA loses people. There's no question that this has had a morale blow to the agency, not just within those working in neuroscience, but beyond it. I'm worried about the long-term trend for the FDA, frankly. I was very optimistic at the beginning of the administration with people like Eric Lander at the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. And it was rumored that Janet Woodcock was going to be picked as FDA commissioner very quickly, which would have boded, been good for the COVID response too, and for certainty. But right now they're tripping over each other with recalls. They can't get their communication straight, and their scientific judgment has been dramatically questioned, by a partner agency, and they're weak. And it's going to have a dramatic effect upon innovation if the course isn't corrected sooner.
Rachel, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I just want to say that, like Joe, I am a law person and not a scientist or a doctor, but as someone with a law degree, that means I care a lot about procedure and whether it can be justified publicly, because I know that it's so important for the public to trust FDA's decisions. So when you put together the procedure around the approval of this product, not just telling the advisory committee this was not going to be an accelerated approval, not just overruling a nearly unanimous advisory committee after which 3 members resigned, not just giving Biogen nearly 9 years to submit the results of a confirmatory clinical trial, but those things together, that's not a recipe for public trust in this decision. And I do think FDA could have approved this drug in a way that was much more publicly justifiable. When we think about patients and providers, they deserve options, but they also deserve to know whether the drugs they may take or prescribe work. They deserve to know not just that a drug is available, but if it will help them. And we just don't know that about Aduhelm.
So I want to just take the opportunity to pivot to a set of issues about patients. So several questions have been raised from the audience. So at the end of the day, so there are a lot of actors here, and mistakes have been made in various ways, and we can debate which were mistakes and which were not mistakes. But certainly the outcome we have at the end of it, we have a drug that is there's not a lot of access to Aduhelm. There's a risk that it will be that what's happened with Aduhelm will potentially have a chilling effect on approvals or maybe reimbursement for future Alzheimer's therapies, arguably. Maybe you want to argue that there's some accelerant, but I mean, there's certainly a fear that it could be chilling for future innovations. So I guess two questions. One is, have patients been made worse off by this whole episode as it stands? And I think everyone's saying yes, that this is not in the interest of patients, and maybe you guys have different reasons and weight different things, but I don't think anybody thinks this is a win for patients. But as such, what do we do to get back on track? This is a dreaded disease. It's a horrible disease. There's a huge unmet need. What steps do we need to take so that patients, Alzheimer's patients today and in the future, will have access to effective, workable innovation? Joe, and then Rachel, maybe weigh in on this broader question.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to Rachel's point about sticking to our core competencies in law. Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said that great cases make for bad law. And I think that this Agile Helm controversy has led to really bad precedent and really bad reimbursement policy from CMS. As I said in the beginning, I would have been more comfortable, let me say that, if CMS's decision had been localized to the Agile Helm issue. I do agree that there's some hankiness to the whole process, and there is a current investigation going on. To Rachel's point, I think they do need sunlight around this. I think they need sunlight around the surrogate endpoint. I think they should have a couple public meetings about it. I think they need some robust discussion with the companies. And I think, frankly, that CMS needs to retract this class-wide decision that they have made. If you look at the original decision they made about the Part B premiums, they anticipated that Part B premiums, just from Agile Helm alone, was going to go up from, I think, $148 to $170 a month. That is somewhat ludicrous to anybody who pays attention to how this therapy was going to be deployed, because you were going to need a $6,000 PET scan. You're going to need to be linked up in care to begin with. The idea that it was going to cost that much it defies, basically the way the therapeutic area is dealt with in the real world. And it speaks to the fact that CMS is not the right regulatory agency to be evaluating stuff like this. They made a big mistake on that prediction, and they couldn't unwind it. They had to admit, sorry, we screwed up and we were wrong in our estimates. But they would have been wrong on the estimates even if they didn't just kill the product, which they effectively did. I don't necessarily mind a registry for this therapeutic area, but to just go out there and say you're going to need to do a randomized clinical trial. Number one, it's going to take forever to do that. And that's a role for FDA to order. Two, it would lead to inequity. It is ridiculous to think that somebody, apologies to any particular region of the country, so I won't choose one, but not everybody has the same access to research institutions that can do a trial like this. So it's going to lead to inequities in care if everybody's got to be involved in a randomized clinical trial after approval. So I think CMS needs to rein this back in, but we will see over the next few months, a few years, about how these other therapies do when making it through FDA and CMS. I mean, FDA got a brushback. There's no question. Nobody's going to be wanting to go out there and take a big risk on the next approval at FDA. It's going to take real courage for the next group of people approving the next amyloid plaque therapy, but they certainly don't need CMS getting ready to second guess them and saying, okay, you did your job, but we've got to worry about the beans coming in and going out, and we're going to require a randomized clinical trial.
Rachel, your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe one very small response and then one more general point. FDA itself had already required, because of the accelerated approval nature of Aduhelm, a confirmatory clinical trial. So it wasn't as if it was news to Biogen that they were going to need to complete the trial. Maybe they thought they would be able to obtain reimbursement while that trial was ongoing, which in itself has been a problem for previous accelerated approval drugs. It's been difficult for companies to enroll clinical trials when patients know that they they could get the drug paid for by their insurer. So for some products, it's taken far longer than FDA has requested to complete those confirmatory trials. This is why FDA is asking for more authority to enforce the terms of those trials as part of the ongoing user fee reauthorization process. So that wasn't news to Biogen, but additional requirements, such as that the trial be representative of the types of patients who are likely to have Alzheimer's. That was novel and important for Biogen to be told that equity matters, that diversity in clinical trials matters, because the initial trials were not representative of the patients in terms of race and ethnicity. More generally, I think Joe raises a very important point about access not only to medications, but a whole range of other types of services. So one thing we might remember here is that even though Medicare has decided to limit coverage for Aduhelm, Medicaid actually doesn't have a mechanism to do this, and Medicaid is still required to provide reimbursement for Aduhelm for patients who are only Medicaid eligible. So with that said, I am still concerned about patients' ability to access this drug because of the types of concerns that Joe was mentioning. Access to specialists, access to scans. These types of things are difficult. They're expensive to get. There may be waiting lists, especially for patients in certain parts of the country, whether or not there's a clinical trial involved. That's those types of disparities by income, by race and ethnicity, by urban versus rural geography. All kinds of disparities exist in our system as a whole, and we should be looking for ways to ameliorate them more generally. This is just one example of the ways in which patients will have inequitable access to care.
Darius, can I just clarify one point? The idea that CMS requiring a clinical trial, the necessity of a clinical trial for phase 4 from FDA, that of course was not a surprise, as Rachel said. But the fact of the matter is, you've got to work out what that clinical trial looks like with CMS, which is not designed to do that. They don't know what they are doing. So Biogen is going to schlep over to CMS and have discussions about how to design a randomized clinical trial, and with a group of people that don't understand how to do it. And it's going to take how long? 12 months, 14 months, 2 years? I mean, one of the reasons why the phase 4 studies at FDA take so long is because it's not as big a priority. Number one, it's not as big a priority for FDA. It's not as big a priority for the company. Two, but they're difficult to do, as Rachel said. I mean, you've got it being deployed in the real world. You've got confounding factors. You don't have as much control as you would in a phase 1, 2, or 3 clinical trial. So they're not exactly simple to do. And it is a huge surprise. It is a massive order of magnitude difference between CMS saying we're going to require a randomized clinical trial and FDA as part of a phase 4.
So thanks, Joe. I want to do a quick lightning round with you guys on the facts of the Aduhelm case and your opinions, and then I have some broader questions. So some themes have been struck here about disparities, particularly in the Medicaid program and elsewhere, and also I think about issues related to surrogate endpoints that extend beyond this particular case. But let me just ask 2 quick questions that have come from the audience. One is, are we ever going to see another accelerated approval in Alzheimer's disease, or are we less likely to see another one today than we were 2 years ago, looking forward? And is that going to be a problem for patients? Maybe just each of you give a quick answer and your forecast for that.
I'd bet against it, absolutely. I mean, my understanding is those companies are still working through the accelerated approval process, but I don't see how anybody at FDA is going to go along with it right now.
Rachel, what's your bet?
I think it depends on the companies, and if they go forward with the accelerated approval process, as I believe they are, as Joe just said, then it's not clear why FDA would change its own mind.
Good. So now, so it sounds like there's skepticism, or at least some caution about whether we're going to get accelerated approval again. The second question I have is, about the CMS process. Should CMS be more transparent about the deliberations that it undertook to come to this decision. There's a question about, whether some audience member asked, should there be release of the internal deliberations and documents? Maybe Rachel, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, so what I think I'll say is there is a public comment and a public meeting process associated with the NCD in a way that is similar to the FDA's advisory committee process, but is more extensive because it happened over a period of several months. There was an opportunity for notice and comment on the draft NCD, which was then amended prior to its final version. So there was already a significant amount of public transparency. Would it be an improvement even to hold public meetings of MedCAC? I think certainly that's an idea worth considering. But I think when you think about the rulemaking process in general, there's nothing concerning about this when you compare it to other types of processes.
Joe?
Yeah, I certainly, I think CMS could benefit from more transparency around these decisions, but I want to just take it a little bit differently, if you would. Rachel's mentioned PDUFA several times. I mean, it's widely understood, everybody agrees, PDUFA has revolutionized the way FDA behaves, their approvals, their standards, and has facilitated communication. Matter of fact, it's a big part of what the companies and FDA negotiate. How many meetings, when can we get response on scientific questions, on clinical endpoints, surrogate endpoints? CMS doesn't have any of that. So designing a clinical trial, asking for scientific feedback, that's all a giant black hole, not subject to any of the procedures that FDA is subject to under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So all those performance goals, none of that applies to CMS if they're going to start wading into FDA's remit. And you're going to end up in an entire black hole for patients and companies, because CMS is not going to be under any obligation to respond in a timely fashion to any question that a company has about how they want the clinical trial to be designed, what clinical endpoint they want to see, what outcomes they want to see, any questions about that you've got in these clinical trial designs. That is the key. It's the heart of what PDUFA does, is facilitate communication on a timely basis between companies and FDA on difficult scientific questions.
So let me take this opportunity to move to a somewhat related, well, it's a theme that's been struck throughout the discussion. So surrogate endpoints are here to stay for a reason, that as healthcare gets better, it's harder and harder to show benefits in clinical endpoints, and we get surrogates. This whole episode and discussion makes me wonder, is our process for handling surrogates not very good? And what can we do, for example, to stimulate the production of post-approval evidence that gets us more certainty that a surrogate benefit will result in clinical benefit, like just real-world studies? Forget about trials necessarily. There are lots of, in every case, we want real-world data generation after approval. This goes well beyond Aduhelm. What could we do to ensure that there's better evidence on the value of surrogates to patients? And is that an FDA issue, or is that some other agency's role to solve?
I'll go first, and then I don't think it's, I think it's a state of science issue. I would like to see FDA leaning in more, frankly, on surrogate endpoints. I'd like to see more hope, more experimentation, more driving forward. As I said, I think it is dramatically altered the trajectory of cancer treatment in the United States. That is a direct result of human beings like Rick Pazdur at FDA saying, I'm leaning in on surrogate endpoints. I'm taking the time to lay this out in guidance and have these communications with companies and with other scientific experts. And frankly, being willing to take the heat for approving drugs under surrogate endpoints. These are human beings making decisions. I'm all for more discussions and more science on the surrogate endpoints and how they play out in the real world. And hopefully, as the science continues to advance, we'll have that. But I think that discussion is more appropriate for FDA and for NIH to some extent.
Rachel?
Yes, I think this is an area where FDA and NIH have a history of collaboration on regulatory science issues, and where, frankly, we can also learn things from trial design in other countries. I know during the pandemic, many of us looked to evidence coming out of the recovery trial in the UK as a particularly well-designed way to get evidence very quickly about some of the products that might be most impactful for patients with COVID. And so thinking through different types of alternatives and different types of new trial designs is important. The only thing I would push back on from your question is that it's not clear to me that the bulk of it should be post-approval, right? That part of it should be pre-approval in thinking about whether some of these surrogate endpoints make sense from a clinical perspective, from a biological perspective, making sure that they fit into the disease model. And so both pre and post approval, thinking through what it looks like to validate these endpoints matters. And that's a great area for collaboration between those agencies.
So let me follow up quickly on that point, Rachel. So the standard in the biostatistics literature is to do a meta-analysis of clinical trials in order to justify a surrogate. So what that really says is that the only way to validate a surrogate is to have a bunch of treatments have gone through and having used the surrogate, which does, I mean, in some sense, it's an inherently conservative view that it's difficult to establish a new surrogate. It takes time. I wonder, is that good enough for us today? Should we be trying something more aggressive with surrogates, or are you comfortable that we need to just wait, even if it means delaying access to new technologies, because we need to see, 5, 6, 7, 8 trials be conducted with the surrogates to see what their long-term effects are going to be?
Well, I think this is precisely why we have the accelerated approval program, where we think about, is there a biological basis in the disease to think that this surrogate endpoint is reasonably likely to be clinically meaningful? That language is in there for a reason. And in the HIV/AIDS context, which was the reason that the accelerated approval process was initially created, it turned out that those surrogates were very, very likely to be related to clinical benefits. But in other contexts, even where we have had a good theory of the case, they have not been quite as related. So as long as there is that theory to begin with, it does matter. But to the extent that there has been evidence of potential failures, that's where we should start asking questions.
So thank you, Rachel, and let me pivot to one final topic as we close this out, which is the question of patient welfare, and particularly vulnerable patients. This is already a vulnerable patient population across the board. There's high unmet need, and then there's a subset of patients that are extremely vulnerable. This is an expensive disease for families. It requires care. All kinds of costs are borne by families with Alzheimer's, facing the journey of Alzheimer's disease. So my question is really, Medicaid's going to play a role here in this ultimately. Let's assume we live in a world where there is an approved disease-modifying therapy. Is there a risk that that's a world in which all of those Medicaid Alzheimer's patients get left behind? And if there is some risk of that, what can we do to mitigate it, or just improve or ensure efficient or equitable access across the board? Joe, and then Rachel.
Yeah, look, clearly equitable access, fighting for the poor and disadvantaged, fighting for the sick. This is the whole reason why you're in healthcare anyway. I mean, there's nobody more disadvantaged than somebody who's sick, flat out. I mean, they're the most in need of any class of people. Is how can you help those who can't help themselves get healthy again? The problem I've got with where we are right now, and what troubles me so much about this Alzheimer's decisions, is that we have had tremendous innovation on the scientific front and new therapies, biologics, small molecule drugs. And we have had zero innovation on the payment side for the last 40 years, with the exception of let's accrue more power in the hands of the bureaucracy. If we had flexibility in reimbursement systems, if Biogen, Lilly, Eisai could, for instance, pay for the PET scans, if they could come up with creative ways instead to finance these drugs, if there were a variety of different payer types, if Medicaid could do different things, we might be having a very different discussion than we've got now, but we have a hobgoblin of regulatory agencies now and regulatory and rules in place that are making it very difficult to pay for these things rationally. And we're going to have more irrational CMS decisions like this if we don't innovate on the payment side.
Thanks, Joe. Rachel, final thoughts on making things better for vulnerable patients?
I think Joe's right that that's absolutely why we're here. And on Medicaid specifically, because it's our safety net program, because we know that it provides care for the most vulnerable Americans, state Medicaid programs that choose to cover prescription drugs, they're actually an optional category of coverage. States actually don't have to cover drugs. They've all chosen to do so. They have to cover essentially all FDA approved drugs, not quite all, but almost all. But for doing that, they get large preferred pricing benefits. They get really big discounts off of the average private market price. They are insulated when the manufacturer raises the price more quickly than inflation. We are insulating our safety net program from some of the worst pricing problems that we face in other markets. We haven't done that in Medicare. And so when we think about flexibility in reimbursement, we could think about extending some of those benefits to Medicare. We could think about empowering Medicare to provide access at lower prices. We could think about negotiating on the basis of value, and all those types of things would make it easier to provide benefits to patients, even where there's some uncertainty about the evidence involved.
All right. Thank you very much to both of you. Please join me in thanking Rachel Sachs and Joe Grogan for what was a lively and stimulating and even entertaining discussion on a very difficult set of issues. And many thanks to all of you out there in cyberspace who joined us today. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day.